The U.S. national debt has just shattered the all-time record for its systemic threat level. The previous record was set 74 years ago by World War II, the bloodiest and most widespread conflict in human history. So how did the national debt reach this new record? And how does it impact you? Let's look at just facts. The U.S. Treasury's official figure for the debt of the federal government is now above $26 trillion. This measure of raw debt has grown through most of the nation's history, but it overstates the scale of debt over time because it doesn't account for inflation, population increases, or economic growth. These factors allow governments to carry more debt with less harm than if their economies were smaller. To adjust for such factors across nations and over time, economists and government agencies commonly measure government debt as a portion of each nation's annual economic output or gross domestic product, GDP. This accounts for varying population sizes, some effects of inflation, and the capacity of governments to service their debts. Over the course of U.S. history, the government's debt-to-GDP ratio has averaged 30.3% and has stayed around or below this level except for a massive spike from World War II and during the modern era. The World War II record of 118.4% held for the past 74 years, but was toppled on May 22, 2020, when it reached 118.5%. By the end of May, it had reached 119.5%, or 4 times its average over the nation's history. It then continued growing and has now surpassed 120%. How did we get to this point, and where are we headed? COVID-19 is part of this story, but only a small part thus far. From the day that the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a pandemic, March 11th, through June 8th, the U.S. national debt rose by $2.5 trillion, or 11.5 percentage points of GDP. This figure, by the way, doesn't account for the vast bulk of economic damage inflicted by government-mandated business shutdowns, which will soon make this ratio significantly larger by decreasing its denominator. Although this decline has already begun, most of it is not yet reflected in the official government data on the size of the U.S. economy. So where did the rest of the debt come from? The main driver of rising debt for the past 6 decades has been increased government spending on social programs, which grew from 20% of federal expenses in 1959 to 62% in 2018. And under current laws and policies, the Congressional Budget Office projects that almost all future growth in debt will be due to increased spending on social programs and interest on the national debt. Nonetheless, many media outlets and politicians have blamed the skyrocketing debt on military spending. In reality, however, military spending has plummeted from 55% of all federal expenses in 1959 to 18% in 2018. These are comprehensive figures that include standard military expenses, supplemental appropriations like those enacted for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and veterans' benefits. Another commonly blamed cause of debt increases is cutting taxes. But the fact is that federal tax revenues have stayed roughly level as a portion of GDP for the past 80 years. They usually declined during recessions and rebounded during recoveries, but the long-term trend has been flat since the 1940s. Before that, tax levels rose dramatically during the Great Depression and New Deal and World War II. From the era of John F. Kennedy in the 1960s through Donald Trump, various Congresses and presidents have enacted a range of tax cuts. However, tax levels have stayed generally stable due to tax increases and a phenomenon called bracket creep. This occurs because inflation and wage increases push workers into higher tax brackets, and many tax laws aren't adjusted for income growth and/or inflation. Thus, if tax cuts are not periodically implemented, taxes consume a continually greater share of people's incomes and the nation's economy. For instance, after the Trump tax cuts of 2017 took effect, the Congressional Budget Office projected in 2018 that the portion of the nation's economy consumed by taxes would rise above its long-term average in several years and then continue on an upward trajectory. Part of this increase is due to the certain expiring provisions of the tax cut in 2026, but the general trend is due to bracket creep. This comprehensive data reveals that many tax cuts were actually tax evens because they kept taxes on a relatively flat trend for more than half a century. But some claim that the national debt doesn't really matter. Given that the debt from World War II was by a large margin the highest U.S. debt in more than 220 years, many people have pointed to it as evidence that large national debts don't harm economies. For example, Douglas J. Amy, professor of politics at Mount Holyoke College, wrote in 2011, "Conservatives are also wrong when they argue that deficit spending and a large national debt will inevitably undermine economic growth. The best example is World War II, when the national debt soared to 120% of GDP, nearly twice the size of today's debt. This spending not only got us out of the Great Depression, but set the stage for a prolonged period of sustained economic growth in the 50s and 60s. Forebodingly, the debt exceeded that of World War II in less than a decade. But even before the COVID-19 pandemic, it was on track to more than double the World War II level in the coming 3 decades. These facts expose the fatal flaw in Amy's argument, the failure to consider that the debt from World War II was a passing spike that plunged after the war, while the modern debt is growing rapidly due to structural issues. The primary difference between the post-World War II era and today is, again, spending. After World War II, federal spending as a portion of GDP fell by 50% within 2 years and averaged 41% less than the last year of the war over the next 4 decades. In contrast, when Amy made his argument, the Congressional Budget Office was projecting that under current policies and a sustained economic recovery over the next 4 decades, federal spending would average 72% higher than in the 4 decades that followed World War II. The publicly held debt, a partial measure of the national debt often used by the Congressional Budget Office, would rise by 277 percentage points and grow thereafter to about 9 times the peak of World War II. In the years following that projection, both debt and GDP outcomes were worse than predicted, and the Congressional Budget Office released a more dire projection in 2013. At that time, Barack Obama and Paul Krugman were dismissing concerns about the national debt, and David Lauder and Michael Hiltzik of the Los Angeles Times were falsely reporting that debt was falling. 6 years later, the outcome was even worse than projected. Unlike the World War II era, the current national debt isn't a passing anomaly, but a systemic, escalating problem fueled by ongoing federal policies. And contrary to the notion that government debt isn't a major problem, a broad range of facts shows that it can have serious negative consequences, such as lower wages, weak economic growth, increased inflation, higher taxes, reduced government benefits, or combinations of such results. These in turn impair people's quality of life and can reduce their life expectancy. Some of these impacts may have already begun. Misinforming people about those matters, numerous media outlets publicized a study said to disprove the connection between high debt and weak economic growth. But the study actually shows what previous studies found. GDP growth decreases by an average of about 30% when government debt exceeds 90% of GDP. The authors of the study, however, buried this data on the 10th page of their paper and wrote a deceitful overview, which the media parroted. The consequences of government debt are not merely potential dangers that might occur at some point in the future. They may, in fact, have already begun. Although association does not prove causation, the national debt has risen dramatically over past decades, and with this, the U.S. has experienced episodes of historically poor growth in GDP, productivity, and household income. These could cause a host of negative impacts on human welfare in areas like education, nutrition, healthcare, and life expectancy. Some people point to Japan, which has a debt-to-GDP ratio of around 200%, as evidence that high national debts are harmless. They claim that Japan has not suffered like Greece, which underwent a debt crisis in 2009, because Japan and other nations that have their own currencies can never run out of money to pay back what they owe, since they can always print what they need as a last resort. In reality, Japan has fared as poorly as Greece when measured by the World Bank's preferred indicator of human welfare, which is people's consumption of goods and services. The difference is that Japan has experienced long-term sluggish growth in its living standards as its debt has surged, while Greece endured a sudden collapse in living standards when its debt bubble burst. Ultimately, they ended up in about the same place. Again, association doesn't equal causation. So these data don't prove that Japan's or Greece's economic woes were caused by debt, but they do debunk the notion that Japan hasn't suffered like Greece. Japan's situation may be even worse than Greece's, for if debt has played a role in Japan's long-running slump, it is more difficult for citizens to understand this and hold politicians accountable for their actions. Hence, the harmful effects continue. While some people imagine that governments can borrow with abandon without hurting people, one of the most established laws of economics is that there is no such thing as a free lunch. The prolific economist William A. McEachern explains why this is so. There is no free lunch because all goods and services involve a cost to someone. The lunch may seem free to you, but it draws scarce resources away from the production of other goods and services. And whoever provides a free lunch often expects something in return. A Russian proverb makes a similar point, but with a bit more bite. The only place you find free cheese is in a mousetrap. I'm Amanda Reed Sheik, here with Just Facts. For thorough documentation of every fact in this video and more facts about this issue, read the article National Debt Breaks Record for Highest Portion of U.S. Economy in Nation's History at justfacts.com.